Let's talk about how technology is redefining learning in our schools and how our children embracing this, and of course the facilitators and all stakeholders. What has changed? What are those things that we still need to change? This morning we want to take a look at moving from the blackboard that you remember, okay, the one that you had the chalk to the board, to now the Smartboard, where you can talk through whatever you're teaching the students through deployment of technology. This morning, we've been joined by a tech education expert, Iso Berse. Thank you indeed for joining us on the program today.
Thanks very much for having me.
You know, I remember those times where you needed to use a blackboard. So over the weekend, let's say on a Friday like this, you would go ahead and ensure that the blackboard was kept dark. In the local setting, let's say public schools, you had I guess a coal, yes, some coal mixed with some leaves, and then you just mix them together to ensure that you darken the board. So when you returned on Monday, the board will be so dark enough for you, black enough for you, I beg to say, to use your chalk on, and then you learn. But that has changed, honestly speaking. What's your view of how the evolution of technology deployment into education has impacted or even is impacting learning today?
Okay, so yeah, I mean, you've taken us back in history to when, well, I guess we went to school and blackboards were used to deliver learning in classrooms. It's one thing to, talk about the tools that are now available to, digitize learning and, make learning more accessible to, to students. But the question I would ask is, have we really left using, blackboards in schools in Nigeria? And I think the answer to that question is, there's a huge dichotomy in education in Nigeria, just like there is in, almost every other aspect of our societies, where you've got the, super rich and you've got the super poor as well. And I can tell you for sure that, there are certain schools in Nigeria that still use the blackboard. So we've not completely left there. So we've got this dichotomy where we have some schools using the blackboards up until the present time, and then we've got those schools that are sort of at the high end of the market, predominantly private schools that use the the smart boards and the digital platforms to facilitate and enhance learning. So so I wouldn't go so far as to agree with you that we've totally left the blackboard. I think we're still on that journey.
Not totally left that, but then it's also very is worthy of us looking into how this has evolved, especially across the private sector, and why indeed the public sector is not embracing this. So we have to divide this discussion into two. And let me remind you that my colleague Ben Wakama will be joining us in this conversation from Port Harcourt to Rivers State as we move on. So what would you consider to be the difference between the child who gets its studies through the traditional way of learning, using the blackboard and the chalk, and that child who has the benefit of being taught deploying a smart board and what have you, other very modern tools of learning?
I think that both children, I would say that the children don't have access to equal opportunities. So back in secondary school, at the time when I went to secondary school many years ago, some of the smartest people in my school were actually from very rural communities. They came into federal government college, they had access to the education of that was afforded at the time, and many of them were top of their class. Now, if students don't have equal access to opportunities, then obviously some get left behind. So if you have maybe the private schools where digital technology is being used. You've got learning platforms where students can go on and have access to to learning content that students in the rural areas don't have. Then those ones obviously get left behind, and that's something that I consider to be very unfortunate, for Nigeria.
To you.
Thank you so much, Isobasi. I laugh. But let me take us back a little bit before the Blackboard, before I continue with my question. We used to have a laptop as a microchip of the Blackboard. You remember the slits as at then, which chalks are being used as well in the rural areas and in the villages. There's one small plank slit that we write on before we moved to the Blackboard. And when we moved to the Blackboard, we have notebooks like the 2A, 2B, 2C, the one with horizontal stripes for English, the one with blocked stripes for mathematics, and the other one with red stripe for handwriting and the drawing book as well. And then from the Blackboard, some schools moved to the marker board, which is prevalent now everywhere. And then came the tech boards with digital experiences, as it were. Now, let's look at the case of Nigeria. Many people agree with you that we've not left the Blackboard or the marker board, as it were, as we speak right now. But the issues are that, look at the issues of internet in Nigeria. The service providers are so epileptic, as it were. Even when we are ready, the internet is not steady. Buying data, bandwidth to be able to operate a tech board, you know how much it is. I mean, you have to scale through the eye of the nose of around before you be able to get that. How many people will be able to get that? And that's one. And then we also have epileptic supply of electricity in this part of the world, and in Nigeria, basically. So if a private school will be able to get all these things at their fingertips, then the school fee will be high. Then you know that there's a few persons that will be able to attend that school. And then I'm asking, with all this put together, in the future, would it be possible for Nigeria to get there? And if it will, like how many years plan would you think that Nigeria will have to be able to achieve this digital technology of learning in schools?
So I think that Nigeria certainly can get there. It does take a plan, like you said. If you look at spend in education, or what we budget annually, for education in Nigeria, I think it's about 7% of total spend. In my opinion, that doesn't reflect a strong priority on education. So if we compare that to a country like, say, Botswana, for example, they spend, I think, about 21% of their annual budget on education. Now, Botswana is a much smaller country than Nigeria, but the reason why I give that example is that, that's a country that has demonstrated how much it values education in its budget. But I mentioned that we budget about 7% on education. There's another question about how much of that 7% is actually spent, and I can assure you that it's a fraction of the 7% that is even budgeted. So that doesn't, in my opinion, reflect a strong commitment on the part of the government to really position Nigeria where it should be in the future in terms of education. So in answering your question, I'd say that the potential is definitely there. I believe it's projected that by 2050, Nigeria, I think, will be the third, most populous country in the world, would have a population of about 400 million. And I think 80% of those people would be under 25. So we can get there, but the question is, are we ready to sit down and converge all our different plans around education, all our strategies, all our programs around education in order to, to take us to where we need to be? So we can, but the question is, are we ready to? Are we doing what we need to in order to position ourselves adequately for the future? And I think the answer is no.
So Basi, what will be the implication where a few children, a few persons are exposed to this particular digital tech, while majority of Nigerians are not exposed to it. When these two meet in the market, the employment market, in the economic market, the political market, in every sphere of life, what will be the implication to the country?
Well, those who have exposure to, good quality education, obviously would have better opportunities in life. So we may see it leading to, more brain drain than, we've seen in the past. So that's a possibility. Those who are better educated, obviously, would tend to enter into the best positions within the private sector, not necessarily the public sector, the private sector, whereas those who are not, would find themselves left behind. Now, what would be the consequence of leaving majority of Nigerian youth behind? I think it would lead to additional youth restiveness. We've had issues with high unemployment in the Niger Delta. We know, how it has set the country back in terms of impacting on, oil production, for example. When youths don't have opportunities, they get creative in negative ways, and so that could obviously impact very significantly on Nigeria as a country. The other factor to bear in mind is that the world has become smaller. So there are people who sit down in Nigeria and who work for top tech companies across the world. And obviously people have good education, those opportunities are available to them, and it increases income of people who live in Nigeria. But if we don't prepare our workforce, then we'll find ourselves really facing challenges in the future. That's obvious.
Let's talk about the fact that the world had been a global village since the invention of the internet, the computer itself, and the internet and what have you. And the COVID-19 deepened it for some countries that weren't ready, might be not even ready right now to embrace e-learning due to the fact that it has to be supported by the use of infrastructure. I mean, you need your computer, sometimes any device that you can put internet on and that you can work with. If you take a look at how the costs of all of these, and in fact the education sector in the country, what do you see in the middle, and what is that gap that needs to be closed?
I think we have huge infrastructure gaps in Nigeria, and infrastructure is something that impacts so many sectors, and of course education is one of them. So we know, of course, electricity, we've got electricity supply issues for as long as we've been Nigerians. So that's a massive issue. Of course, technology is driven by electricity, but there are ways of mitigating things like this. So there are renewable energy options that don't have to make educational infrastructure in schools, especially in rural areas, dependent on the national grid. So that's a possibility. Internet connectivity, of course, is also very important. And, even though we talk about, I think, penetration of about 45% at the moment in Nigeria, the quality of service is very, very bad. I spent a month in Nigeria just a few weeks ago. I actually returned to the UK, and I spent some time in Calabar. I spent some time in Lagos as well. The quality of service in Calabar was so poor, and I thought, okay, this is Calabar. Maybe when I get to Lagos, things will be better. And then I get to Lagos, and I'm, sitting down in Ikoyi trying to work, and realize that that the challenges were also in Lagos. So we've got massive challenges around, power supply. We've got challenges, even though we say internet penetration probably at, broadband penetration probably at 4.45%. What's the quality of service? How often is it available? How many hours a day do you have access to the internet? And when you do have access, what kind of speeds do you have? So I think infrastructure is something very important. I think that we need to also invest in training teachers adequately. So it's one thing to have these technology tools, but if these tools are in the hands of analog teachers in quotes, then the outcomes would be suboptimal.
All right, so I'd like you to look around you under this administration of President Bola Tinubu and the way the education sector is being paid attention to at the center. And perhaps take Cross River State, Calabar, where you said you visited when you came to Nigeria just recently, and some other parts of Nigeria you've been to. Are there peculiarities with regards to how education, especially mode of teaching, perhaps even curriculum, issues that have to be taken care of such that Nigerian students can adequately, enjoy what e-learning could bring his way or her way?
So I think that, of course, the states would be at different levels when it comes to how they prioritize education. I know I've heard about one or two initiatives in, I think, Anambra State, for example, that have to do with, digitizing classrooms and, putting in smart learning solutions. The extent to, how long that has been going for and the extent of its success, I don't know. So some states definitely will be ahead of others. I think generally the states probably budget a bit more on education than the federal government does. But again, the question arises about how much of the money that's budgeted for education is actually spent on education, and I think that is low across all of the states. In terms of federal government initiatives, I think it was the Universal Basic Education Commission that, came up with a program, and I think it had something to do with delivering 1,000 smart boards or smart solutions to schools across the country. And when you think about the fact that there are 36 states and the Federal Capital Territory, and you have 1,000 solutions being pushed across, that translates to, I think, about 27 solutions per state. That's a drop in the ocean. That seems to me more like a political gesturing rather than, actually wanting to, drive a program across the country that delivers true value in terms of education. So I think there's a lot of lip service being paid to education in Nigeria, both at the state and both at the federal and the state levels. And I think it's an indication of the low priority that we place on education. And I think that needs to change. Like I said, especially if we're strategic and we're thinking about, where Nigeria will be in terms of its demography in, say, 2050, for example. So that type of thinking needs to drive strategic change in the education sector.
All right, good to see. Then we don't have all the time, but let me ask this final question before we go. And looking at all the parameters that have been put in place, as it were, in the face of this dwindling economy, as it were, in Nigeria, I still ask, how are we able to achieve that if we don't address some issues? Like I said, the issues of internet, I told you, the internet providers have not been checked. We're still worried about how even when we pay high for data, we cannot even get it. We're still looking at the infrastructure. You need good classrooms. You need to buy this boards, as it were. We need good electricity. And so looking at all this infrastructure, if we do not check the various parastatals, or if we do not check the various institutions that make sure these things are stable, then how can we be able to achieve this?
Well, very true. So, I guess recommendation for government would be, you've got to tackle infrastructure. There's no way of bypassing infrastructure. Infrastructure is one of those things. It's foundational, right? So everything, there's a potential to drive things using technology, not just in education, in healthcare, in agriculture, in whatever it is. So infrastructure has to be that foundation. And, this is not, everybody realizes that, we know it, but what steps are we taking to actually, address the deficit in infrastructure? So my recommendation is, deal with infrastructure. I think also that there's got to be that strategic priority, like I said, and that priority then is where you derive your plans and your strategies and your programs from. So if there isn't that strategic, plan to position Nigeria ahead of, properly, for the future, like I said, 2050, you could have 300 million young people who are restive, who have nothing to do, and that's going to be a crisis. So there's got to be strategic thinking, and that strategic thinking needs to be the driver for government programs. And if it is, then you're not going to be sharing 1,000 solutions across states in Nigeria, because that's nothing. You might as well not even do that. Okay, so you need to be thinking about how we can ensure that no child is left behind. No child is left behind. And it may not be the case that we go fully 100% smart, because we just can't afford it and it's unrealistic. But what is it that we can do that would raise the quality of education and make that quality of education accessible to every child across Nigeria, that may be a hybrid of digital and analog, for example? So I think there's got to be that realistic thinking. And then a lot has to go into training of teachers as well, like I said, because the teachers deliver the learning, whether it's using smart tools or not, so that's also going to be a strategic priority.
We have to
Thank
go.
you so much, Iso Basi.
Yeah, thank you.
Quite a welcome having you here.
All right. Issa, before you go, I know that in the UK it will be definitely different in terms of the format of learning, of teaching, and then learning by students and what have you. But if you look at our nation, where we are at the moment as we host them on the show today, what are those things you feel that despite the monies that government would say, money not really there, what can be done quickly to bridge the gap between those who have access to smart learning and those who don't?
So I think, okay, yes. So perhaps putting a digital device in the hands of every child in Nigeria might be unrealistic. It might just be too expensive to do that. But I think investing in the training of teachers to teach children properly, I think is something that's achievable, right? It doesn't depend that much on infrastructure. If the teachers are teaching, have access to good quality material, and they're able to teach that to students across all the villages and all the local governments in Nigeria, I think that's a step forward. So there's some inexpensive things. I think that also if we want to jump into introducing digital learning and stuff in schools, it's possible, and we can look at things like solar devices to help power schools in rural areas. These things are there. Solar technology is becoming less and less expensive. So there are options, they're inexpensive options, in my opinion. And there could be a phased approach where we say, okay, this is what we do. The first phase, we train teachers, make sure that we also monitor the quality of teaching, and then we can then move into perhaps at some point putting a digital device in the hands of of students. So I think there could be a phased approach to it.
Thank you indeed. Iso Bassi, tech education experts reaching us from the UK today, was in Nigeria a few weeks ago, hoping that we get to hear from you in terms of how we can bridge the gaps here and that you can contribute also, regardless of where you are. We thank you indeed, Iso.